The first thing I noticed about Emmett Boyle was that he smelled like a horse, and didn't seem to think that was worth apologizing for. He was standing outside the land office in Laramie on a Thursday morning in October, leaning against the post like the building belonged to him, chewing something, hat pulled so low I couldn't read his eyes. He had 3 days of stubble, a canvas coat with a frayed collar, and boots that had seen 2 hard winters without a single trip to the cobbler. The letter in my hand said the man I was meeting would be punctual and presentable. It did not say anything about the smell. I am a storyteller, not a judge. But I want to be honest with you before I begin. The woman who stood across from Emmett Boyle that morning had already made up her mind. She had decided in 30 seconds, the way we all do, the way we swear we don't, and she was so completely, embarrassingly wrong that it took her the better part of a year to fully admit it. Her name was Frances Hartwell. She was 36 years old, a widow out of Denver, and she had spent the previous 2 years running her late husband's dry goods operation, with a precision that impressed the accountants, and irritated the men who assumed they should be doing it instead. She had kept the books, settled the debts, renegotiated the supply contracts, and turned a failing store into a solvent one, and then the landlord had sold the building out from under her, and she had found herself with capital, competence, and no particular place to put either one. The advertisement had been in the Denver paper, small and plain, the kind that serious people placed and desperate people ignored. It read, Wyoming ranching operation, 3,200 acres, seeks a business partner with bookkeeping experience and willingness to work, no romantical expectations, equal share of profit and decision-making. References required on both sides. Frances had read it 3 times, then she had written back. The correspondence lasted 4 months. The man on the other end, Emmett Boyle, ranch outside of Wheatland, wrote the way some men talk, not often, and only when he had something to say. His letters were short. They were also infuriatingly correct. He had a grasp of land valuation she hadn't expected. He knew cattle pricing cycles better than her husband's old business partner, who'd spent 30 years in the trade. When she challenged his projections, he didn't retreat. He explained, point by point, where her numbers were wrong and where they were right, and he did it without any of the careful hedging that men used when they were trying not to offend a woman. She respected that. She wrote back sharper than she intended. He wrote back sharper still. By the 3rd month she had stopped arguing and started listening. By the 4th she had agreed to come to Laramie to meet in person before signing anything. She had not expected the smell or the silence. He looked at her for a long moment after she introduced herself and said, "Train ride okay?" That was it. "Train ride okay." Frances said it was fine, thank you, and thought with absolute clarity. I have traveled 300 miles to go into business with a man who has the social grace of a fence post. She was wrong about that, but it would take a drought, a near disaster with the water rights, and one very cold night in a line shack outside Wheatland to understand how wrong. The ride out to the ranch took most of the afternoon. Emmett drove. He did not attempt conversation. Frances attempted it twice and received answers that were technically complete and emotionally barren. She gave up around the 2nd hour and watched the country instead, which was, she had to admit, extraordinary. The Laramie Plains in October had a particular quality of light she hadn't seen anywhere else. Flat and gold and going on forever, like the land itself was showing off. After a long silence, Emmett said, "Antelope." She looked. There was a small herd moving parallel to the wagon, 200 yards out. "Keep you that," he said. "Keep up with the wagon, nobody knows why. Been watching them do it my whole life." Frances looked at him. He was watching the antelope with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not wonder exactly. Something quieter than wonder. Something that had been watching long enough that it didn't need to announce itself anymore. She looked back at the antelope. "Do they always stop when you stop?" she asked. "Usually," he said. "Try it." She looked at him. He was serious. She said, "You're driving." He pulled the horse to a halt. The antelope ran on another 20 yards and then, gradually, slowed. Stood. Looked back at them. She stared at this for a moment. "That," she said, "is genuinely strange." "Yes," Emmett said, and clicked the horse back into motion. It was the most he had volunteered since Laramie. Frances filed it away somewhere and said nothing. The ranch house was larger than she expected and in considerably better repair. There was a main house, 2 outbuildings, a bunkhouse where 2 hands lived, and a barn that was newer than everything else. The fencing was recent. The equipment was maintained. The place had the look of someone who didn't spend money he didn't to but didn't let things fall apart either. Inside the main house, the kitchen was clean and spare. There was a sitting room with 2 chairs and a shelf of books that made Frances stop walking. She counted quickly. 40, maybe 50 volumes. Agricultural texts, yes, but also history, philosophy. A battered copy of Adam Smith. 2 volumes of Thoreau. A geological survey of Wyoming territory from 1878 with so many pages marked that the ribbon had given up and lay flat somewhere in the middle. Emmett showed her the room she would use during the evaluation period. It had a bolt on the inside of the door, he said. The agreement was a 60-day trial before either of us commits to anything. That's still what I'm proposing. You look at the books, the land, the operation. I'll answer what I can. At the end of 60 days we decide if this makes sense. He said it the way you'd explain a business arrangement to a banker. No apology, no softening, no performance of hospitality. Frances said, the book's first tomorrow morning. Emmett said, 6 o'clock. She had expected to find problems. She had not expected the particular kind of problems she found. The ranch was by the numbers doing moderately well. Emmett's cattle operation was sound. His culling decisions were sharp, his grazing rotation better than anything she'd seen documented in the trade papers. He understood the land at a level that went beyond management into something closer to instinct. The herd was healthy, the pasture was healthy. But the business side was a disaster. Not from dishonesty, from indifference. He had 4 different accounts at 3 different banks, none of them organized in any coherent system. His supplier contracts had been allowed to renew automatically for years, meaning he was paying 1881 prices for some inputs in 1889. He had a standing arrangement with a buyer in Cheyenne that had made sense when cattle prices were what they were 5 years ago, and had quietly become a bad deal without anyone sitting down to notice. Frances sat with the ledgers for 3 days. She came out on the 4th morning and set a number on the kitchen table. Emmett looked at it. She said, that's how much this operation has left on the table in the last 4 years by my calculation. Conservative estimate. He looked at the number for a long time, then he show me. She showed him. He didn't argue. He didn't get defensive. He asked 3 questions, 2 of which she hadn't thought to answer yet, and 1 of which she didn't have an answer for at all. She went back to the ledgers. By the end of the first week, Frances had stopped thinking about the smell and the silence and the frayed collar, and had started thinking about the fact that this man had built a 3,000-acre operation largely alone, kept it running through 2 bad winters and a beef price collapse in 1886, and done it with a bookkeeping system held together with approximately the same structural integrity as a barn in a windstorm. She started to understand something her first impression had entirely missed. Emmett Boyle did not care about appearance. Not his own, not his office's, not the impression he made on visitors from Denver. What he cared about was the land, the cattle, and whether the decisions he made today were going to hold up in 10 years. He was not careless, he was selective. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that the things most people spent energy maintaining were not worth the energy, and he had redirected that energy into the things that actually mattered. The frayed collar was not neglect. It was a choice about what deserved attention. Frances was not yet ready to say she had been wrong. But she was beginning to suspect she had been looking at the wrong things. Her first real test came in the 3rd week. She had renegotiated the supplier contract with the feed merchant in Laramie. A conversation that had taken 2 hours and required her to produce documentation the merchant had not expected her to have and make an argument he had not expected her to make. She came back to the ranch having saved $43 annually on a single contract, she told Emmett. He said. She waited. He said, Caldwell or Pierce? She said, Caldwell. He said, Caldwell's been trying to underprice Pierce for 2 years. He'll honor it for 1 season and then find a reason to raise. Get it in writing for 3. Frances stared at him. She went back to Laramie the following week and got it in writing for 3 years. Caldwell hadn't offered that, she'd had to push. But she got it. She came back and told Emmett. He said, good. He went back to fixing the fence section he'd been working on. Frances stood in the yard for a moment and then went inside to look at the water rights documentation, which was the next thing on her list and which turned out to be the thing that nearly ended everything. The water rights were a mess. Not Emmett's fault. They predated him, went back to the original homestead claim, and had been disputed intermittently for 15 years by a neighboring operation owned by a man named Gideon Falk. Falk had a newer claim, a better lawyer and a county commissioner who owed him favors. He had been chipping away at the Eastern Creek access for years with complaints, delays and 2 outright legal challenges that Emmett had beaten but at considerable cost. When Frances pulled the documentation and laid it out, she understood immediately that a 3rd challenge was coming. The signs were there if you knew how to read filings. Falk had recently transferred a parcel in a way that repositioned his claim relative to the water table. He wasn't preparing to fight over the surface rights. He was going to argue the underground source. She told Emmett. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know. She said, you know? He said, been watching him move that parcel for 6 months. Didn't know what he was doing with it until you explained it just now. She said, why didn't you say something? He said, didn't have enough of the picture. Didn't want to borrow trouble before I understood it. Frances sat with that for a moment. She said, I have a cousin in Cheyenne who does land law. She's handled water rights cases before. Emmett looked at her. She good, Frances said. She's the best in the territory. She's also the reason people in Cheyenne stopped underestimating women in courtrooms about 4 years ago. A pause. Emmett said, write to her. They spent the next 2 months building the case together. It was not romantic. It was not scenic. It was documents and serves and depositions, and 2 trips to Cheyenne, and a great deal of correspondence, and several arguments about strategy that Francis won half of, and Emmett won the other half of, and one argument about the underground aquifer mapping that neither of them won because they were both wrong, and Francis's cousin had to explain it to them in a letter that was notably diplomatic, but which Francis was fairly certain contained the legal equivalent of "I cannot believe I have to explain this to both of you." Through all of it, Emmett worked. He was up before dawn every day, he fixed things. He checked the herd. He knew every animal by name. Not sentimental names, useful ones, names that indicated something about the animal's disposition, or quirks. He talked to his 2 hands the way you'd talk to people whose judgment you trusted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue orders he hadn't thought through. When one of the hands, a young man named Dell, made a mistake that cost them 2 days of work, Emmett explained what had gone wrong and what to do next time and did not mention it again. Francis watched all of this the way you watch something when you're trying to figure out if it's what it looks like. It was. In the 6th week of the trial period, Francis reorganized the entire accounting system. She built it to be maintained by someone who wasn't her. A system that could run without a bookkeeper on site, with clear categories and a schedule for reviewing contracts. She presented it to Emmett on a Tuesday afternoon and walked him through it. He asked 4 questions. 3 of them were about edge cases she hadn't considered. He was right about 2 of them. She adjusted, he said. "You built this to leave." She said, "I built this to last. Whether I'm here or not." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because a good system shouldn't depend on any one person." He said, "That's not what I asked." Francis stopped. He said, "Why build something that careful for an operation you're still deciding about?" She didn't have an answer ready, which was unusual for her. She said, "Because it needed doing," which was true, but wasn't the whole truth. And she knew from the way he looked at her that he knew it too. He didn't push. He turned back to the ledger. Francis went for a walk, which was something she had started doing in the evenings. Because the plains at dusk were the kind of thing you could not ignore if you had any responsiveness to beauty left in you at all. And she had more than she generally admitted. The 60-day trial ended on a Tuesday in December. They sat at the kitchen table with the partnership agreement that the Cheyenne lawyer had drafted. Francis had read it 4 times. Emmett had read it twice and made 2 marginal notes that were both substantive. Francis said, "Before we sign this, I want to say something." Emmett waited. She said, "When I arrived in October, I had already made up my mind about you. In about 30 seconds outside the land office. I decided you were rough and you were quiet and you probably weren't as sharp as your letters suggested, and I was going to spend 60 days figuring out a graceful way to decline." Emmett said nothing. She said, "I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that embarrasses me, because I pride myself on being someone who looks at evidence. And I didn't look at evidence. I looked at your coat." Emmett said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "You had a particular expression when you came out of the land office. I've seen it before. People from cities look at a rancher the way they look at a used horse, checking for visible defects." She said, "And you said nothing." He said, "Didn't seem worth saying. Either you'd figure it out or you wouldn't. Couldn't make you see something you weren't ready to see." Francis said, "That didn't frustrate you?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. He said, "A little. But I figured if you couldn't get past a frayed collar, the partnership wouldn't have worked anyway. Would have been worse to find that out in year 2 than in week 1. Francis looked at the partnership agreement on the table. Then she picked up the pen. She signed it. He signed it. Outside, the first real snow of December was beginning to come down over the Laramie plains, slow and heavy, covering the brown grass white. It was not a romantic beginning, but it was an honest one, and in Francis Hartwell's experience, honest beginnings aged better. The water rights case was decided the following March in their favor. Francis's cousin argued it in front of a territorial judge in Cheyenne and won on the underground aquifer mapping, which turned out to be the strongest ground after all. Gideon Falk did not try a 4th challenge. The word was that he'd moved his legal attention to a dispute in Goshen County, which was someone else's problem now. Francis took over the financial management of the operation entirely. In the first full year of the partnership, she renegotiated 4 contracts, identified 2 revenue streams Emmett hadn't been pursuing, and reduced their input costs by enough that they were able to expand the herd by 200 head without taking on debt. Emmett managed the land and the cattle the way he'd always managed them, with an attention so complete and unsentimental that it bordered on love, though he would not have used that word. They argued frequently. About expansion timing, about whether to build a second well before or after the fence repair, about the merits of a new grazing rotation model. Francis had read about in an agricultural journal and Emmett was skeptical of. He was right about the well timing. She was right about the grazing rotation. They kept a running informal tally, and by the end of the 2nd year it was close enough that neither of them could claim the advantage. Emmett's 2 hands, Dell and an older man named Perce, took to Francis the way working people take to someone who respects their competence. She learned their names early and used them. She asked their opinions on things and actually listened. She did not condescend and she did not defer, and they understood the difference. In the spring of the second year, a late blizzard came down out of the north without the warning the weather usually gave. It dropped 2 feet of snow in 36 hours and drove the temperature to 20 below. They lost the use of the main road for 4 days. On the second night, one of the pregnant heifers got loose from the barn in the chaos and turned up missing. Emmett went out to find her in the dark, in the storm, alone, because he wouldn't send Dell or Perce into it. Frances pulled on every piece of warm clothing she owned and went after him. He found her a quarter-mile out, already heading back, the heifer roped and moving. He saw Frances coming through the snow and his expression in the lantern light was not grateful and not angry. It was something she didn't have a word for. Something that looked like recognition. She said, "I wasn't going to let you go alone." He said, "Didn't ask you to come," she said. "I know." They got the heifer back. They got themselves back. Frances spent the next hour thawing her hands over the wood stove, while Emmett settled the cattle and checked the barn twice and finally came in and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it. He sat down across the table and drank his coffee in silence. After a long time she said, "You knew, didn't you, back in October, that I'd already judged you?" He said, "Yes," she said, "and you waited." He said, "What else was I going to do?" Frances looked at him. The lantern was low. Outside the storm was still running, the heifer was safe, the coffee was hot. The accounting books were in the next room with a system in them that would last 20 years if maintained correctly, and she had built them knowing she would stay, even before she'd admitted it to herself. She said, "I owe you an apology, a real one. Not what I said at the signing." Emmett said, "You don't owe me anything, you figured it out," she said. "I almost didn't," he said. "But you did." He said it the way he said most things, without emphasis, without performance, like a fact that didn't need decoration. And somehow that was worse and better at the same time, because it meant he had never held it against her, not even quietly, not even for a moment. Frances Hartwell, who had stood outside a land office in Laramie and decided everything important about a man in 30 seconds, drank her coffee and said nothing else. Some things don't need to be said when they've already been understood. They ran the ranch together for 19 years. Frances kept the books and grew the operation from 3,200 acres to nearly 5,000. Emmett managed the land with the same, unhurried, total attention he'd always given it, and the land returned the favor the way land does when someone is actually paying attention to it. They built a second well in the 4th year, which was the right call, and extended the fence in the 7th, which was also right. They were wrong about a few things. A bad investment in a rail spur project that went nowhere, a herd decision in 1897 that they argued about for years afterward, without resolution, a drought in 1901 that no one had predicted and no one could have entirely prepared for. They came through all of it. They did not have a dramatic love story. What they had was harder to name and more durable, a partnership that had been tested from the first hour, that had asked both of them to see more clearly than they were used to, and that had held up. Frances never stopped being direct. Emmett never started being talkative. They argued their way through almost every large decision and were usually both better for it. She kept the frayed canvas coat. He'd replaced it sometime in the second winter, finally, with a proper wool one. But she'd found the old one in the barn one evening when she was looking for something else, and she'd brought it inside without saying why. When her niece visited years later and asked about it, Frances said, "That coat was the first thing I judged him on. I looked at the fraying and thought I knew everything I needed to know." Her niece said, and Frances said, "And I was 22 seconds into knowing him, which is to say, I knew nothing." She paused. "The coat still hangs on a peg in the mudroom. I put it there the second winter and I've never moved it. Not because I'm sentimental. Because every time I walk past it I remember the version of myself that stood outside that land office and thought she had good judgment." She smiled the way people smile when a thing has stopped being painful and become simply true. She did have good judgment. She had excellent judgment about ledgers and contracts and water rights law. She had terrible judgment about people, and it took her 60 days in the better part of a Wyoming winter to figure that out. I try not to let her forget it. Emmett Boyle died in 1911 at the age of 63, after a short illness that moved faster than anyone expected. Frances was with him. She outlived him by 14 years, running the ranch through the war and the hard years after with the same system she had built in that first winter, the one she had made to last without her if it had to. It didn't have to. She kept the operation until 1922, when she passed the management to a foreman she had trained herself. A young woman from Casper who reminded her, she said, a little of herself. Sharp. Certain. In need of one good winter to find out what she didn't know yet. I've thought about Frances Hartwell more times than I can count since I first came across her story. Not because she was remarkable in the way people usually mean. She was not famous. She did not do anything that ended up in the newspapers, except the water rights once, in the back pages. What she did was quieter than that. She caught herself being wrong, and she stayed long enough to find out the truth. Most of us walk away before the truth gets a chance to arrive. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. Have you ever met someone who gave you a bad first impression? Someone you had mentally dismissed before they'd said 10 words, and then discovered, too late or just in time, that you had missed something? That the person you decided wasn't worth your time was exactly the kind of person you'd been looking for all along? If that story sounds familiar, I'd like to hear it. Leave it in the comments, because I think more of us have been Francis Hartwell at that land office than we're comfortable admitting. And I think more of us have been Emmett Boyle, too. Standing there in a coat with a frayed collar, waiting patiently for someone to look past the first 30 seconds and see who we actually are.